Good afternoon, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here, and I am incredibly excited today because with me is my good friend. I think I can call him my friend. He's also a very wise person, and I think I could agree with calling him an elder in the sense of a wise person who can help us through the current quagmire that we are currently in with respect to this. So I would like to welcome Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson to the program, the Rational Space Disputations program. Welcome, Lloyd.
Thank you for that welcome. A generous welcome, I might add, Francis.
Yes,
Hopefully I can live up to a part of that.
I think you will. I definitely think you will. If there's one person who I think can help us deal with the current problems that we are facing with respect to discussion. So there's many problems. Neither of us would pretend that we're able to, wave a magic wand and solve all these problems. But right now, the major problem I think we're having is being able to discuss these areas with respect to Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations honestly and openly and in good faith, with the hope that, if we feel that we're maybe mistaken in an opinion, then there's no shame in saying, I think maybe I should rethink that. Like maybe I just didn't understand what was going on. So that's the hope.
Is that not the definition, the very definition of reconciliation, is to be able to have that kind of open discussion?
Well, it depends. As you know, in this current woke environment, words often do not mean what their definition is, their dictionary definition is. So, well, in this book, and we're going to talk, this is what we're going to do. So this is the problem, serious problem that we are facing, which is, it's a very difficult, the residential schools is the general kind of subject, but then there's the book, which, many people are very upset by,
Well,
which yeah.
yeah, that I read the book. Thank you for sending it to me.
Yes.
Well, I didn't find it very controversial.
Okay. Well, that is very interesting. So I guess what we're going to do in terms of this format is I will be asking Lloyd a question, and then Lloyd will ask me a question just to make sure that things can be covered that maybe were left out, and also so that it's not an unbalanced situation. Since balance, I think we can all agree that like sort of the idea of balance and justice, as people know, is a blindfolded woman holding a scale, and the justice is when the scales are balanced. That's the idea. And if the scales are imbalanced, then that's not justice. So we are all well, I don't know. There might be some people out there who are opposed to justice, but both Lloyd and I think I can assume, are in favor of justice. And so we would like to move towards justice in this discussion and away from injustice. That's one of the goals I think that we would share. So maybe before we actually talk about the nuts and bolts of grave error and some of the arguments and some of the possible criticisms that you might have, you have done some research. I have read some of your materials, which I have posted on the wokeacademy.info website, I should mention. Talk about some of your experiences in dealing with people who have gone to residential schools. And I was wondering if you could just let our listeners know about your background with respect to looking at the residential schools.
Well, yes, and thank you for that. I have been involved with residential schools in one way or another most of my life, and I mean that quite literally.
Okay.
When I was a teenager and visiting friends on reserve, I didn't personally go to residential school, but I had friends who did, and we would share stories. And I knew that they had strong discipline, like the strap was used. but then it was not just used at residential schools, it was used at other schools, provincial schools as well. But but certainly the residential schools had a reputation. So I was asked by the chiefs to conduct a study in Saskatchewan. Now, this is something that is not talked about very much. The federal government went about closing the church-run residential schools in around 1970. Some were closed before that, some were slightly after that. The chiefs in Saskatchewan lobbied the federal government to keep them open. And the initial arrangement with the federal government had chiefs and councils forming boards dependent on which reserve communities were feeder schools for particular residential schools, and they would run the plant. They would be responsible for the maintenance and the hiring of childcare staff and so on. And the federal government was responsible for curriculum and instruction. So the federal government would hire the teachers. My role as a young man, along with a colleague, his name was Perry Redmond, we did a study for the Qu'Appelle Residential School to have the final instruction and curriculum part of it transferred from the federal authority to these existing band council authorities. And the reason I say band council, there would be several bands that would contribute, but they were all members of chief and council who formed the board of the residential school. So, of course, in doing this study, I was curious, having been raised and we knew of things that had happened at residential schools, why the chiefs wanted to keep them open. And so, I would ask, and I got two answers. And the two answers were this. Number one, the residential schools offered a large enough student body that they could have a varied curriculum and sports activities. Sports was like hockey, football was very important. And so there was the residential schools had a larger student body conducive to that than band day schools, recognizing that the majority of bands in Saskatchewan, we have a couple of large ones in the north, but in the south, the majority of bands might have a population of 300, 500 people. So you work out how many students are out of that, and it's not a very large school, K to 12. So that was one reason. The other reason was child welfare. There were dysfunctional families. Where to put the kids when the families... And so later on in my private practice, I would have... I've had clients tell me that they saw residential school as a safe haven because their families were brutal. Bad things happened at home, so they looked forward to going to residential school. So those were the two main reasons, and it's interesting to note that for example, in Stanley Mission, which is it's in northern Saskatchewan, Stanley Mission used to be a fly-in / canoe-in, boat-in community. And they got themselves a road. I think it was built in the 1960s, and a school, a local school. And it's actually they got two schools, and they're good facilities. Yet half of the Stanley Mission population continued to send their children to the Prince Albert Indian Residential School, even after the day schools were built on that community. So that was part of my my experience with residential schools. Then later, as a therapist, as a psychologist, I would counsel people who have gone to residential schools, and of course, the people I would counsel had bad experiences by and large.
Mm,
That's why they're presenting for counseling. And there was a variety of bad experiences, which I could talk about and elaborate on. But one of the things that I worked on, which might be an article that of mine that you've read, had to do with the concept of Indian residential school syndrome.
yes, I have read that article. Yeah.
Yes, and my take on that is it's somewhat different from PTSD. My take on it was what was different was the selves of some people, and not everybody who went to residential school had residential school syndrome,
Mm,
not even a majority, but there were those whose selves were poorly formed and ended up with a particular syndrome. And I'll give you an example that I think I used in my article. One of the things I've done is I've done workshops and group sessions, both with both men and women who've had anger issues. And so a typical question I would put might be, okay, you've told me that you can't control your anger. Were you angry when the cop came to the door? Damn right I was. Did you hit the cop? Are you crazy? No, nobody hits the cop. Well, not exactly nobody.
mm,
Somebody with residential school syndrome just might.
yes.
So there are certain features that make it distinctive, but I want to emphasize most people who went to residential schools, from my experience, didn't present with the syndrome, but it's there, and it's worth discussing how things can get generalized, and we assume we paint everything with a broad brush, and the facts, the truth is often a bit more nuanced.
Mm, okay. Well, that's very, there's a lot there. I did read that piece on the residential school syndrome, which is on the wokeacademy.info website for people who are interested in this work. And I believe there are 3 case studies of people in that article about it. And it was a lot of things were running through my mind. And one of the things is, and this is some of the conversations that I've had with other people on my research group, and it concerns like the nature of institutionalized settings for children. So when children are raised in institutionalized settings, and whether that is part of the problem or not, because I've heard, even, I'm not sure if you know the novelist Graham Greene, but Graham Greene was I don't know if he was in a boarding, but he had to do a lot of these institutionalized like features, which are like you're constantly jostling with other people in a closed kind of space. So, and he was a very private person. And although he was an intellectual, he would go and hide in an area of like some kind of hedges and spend all day there, avoiding the whole resident. It was kind of a residential school environment because of his sensitivity. And I'm wondering whether this is part of it, or whether it's more to do with indigenous culture, that there seems to be so much kind of, well, not universal, as you're saying. It probably has to do with the personalities of the people involved, but whether it's an indigenous cultural thing, or whether it's a institutionalized care setting for children who are particularly sensitive to these kinds of regimented approaches. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, is there something particular about indigenous culture that might make these institutionalized settings more traumatizing or psychologically difficult?
Possibly. Now, I want to be careful with the term indigenous culture,
Okay.
because there is no such thing. There's
Okay.
many, many cultures. And but one of the things that has been talked about before has been that in many Aboriginal cultures, corporal punishment was unheard of.
Mm,
Uh, Now, what was done for discipline instead of corporal punishment? Well, typically it was shaming. Now, psychologically, I'm not sure which is worse. However, having said that, I want to say something general that I think you alluded to. I've watched documentaries on residential schools or boarding schools in Britain.
yeah.
We've all I think most of us have heard of Charles Dickens as someone who wrote about that. I watched documentaries in uh, residential schools on Australia, both for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, and also for there's a whole I can't remember, a couple of thousand children from Britain that were transported to Australia and put in schools there. All of the schools had a problem with hierarchy and bullying and of course there's a certain amount of you could expect it. It's like a magnet. If one was a pedophile and one wanted to molest children, well, one would then go to where the children are, right?
Yes.
It operates like a
True.
kind of a magnet. Not saying that most of the teachers and most of the childcare workers, I'm not saying they were all pedophiles, but a few were.
Mm,
And as we've seen as examples, like there's a residential school in northern British Columbia where one a childcare worker over the course of his career molested a couple of hundred children.
mm.
So you get just one, and they can they can do a lot of damage. So we're looking at an institution that I would not recommend. And then there's another factor when it came to the Canadian Indian residential schools. They were church run.
Mm,
What was the motivation of the churches? Well, the motivation of the churches was to proselytize.
mm.
So this is something that is in addition to and separate from the mission to educate. And so you mix all that together, and well, frankly, I think you agree, Francis, it was a bad mix.
Yes, it's interesting thinking about like what would the residential schools have been like? This is just a hypothetical. If it hadn't been run by religious orders and had been a more secular kind of approach, but of course that's just wishful thinking in the sense that at the time, first of all, religion was the norm, and to even express an atheistic position would have, would have gotten you into serious trouble. As well, it was hard to get people to go to many of these residential schools. Like the pay was not good, there was not good remuneration. And so the incentive for people to go to the resident to teach and to be in these isolated areas was you have a captive audience for religious proselytizing. So there are certain circumstances that made that sort of inevitable, I guess, in that situation. So I think that was kind of adding to the problems of trying to be sensitive. I guess like this is what I think is a big problem of the residential schools. Like I know that there is this abusive problems, and everyone recognizes yes, that's but that was not the raison d'etre of the residential. That was just a terrible effect because of, as you were saying, you could have these predators operating without much oversight in these areas. So that made the problem worse than it would be if there was it was in a more central location and so on. But the insensitivity, that's what really, I think, strikes me when I read much of this, is that about the residential schools, the historical documents, is that there wasn't really an understanding that when you're trying to deal with cultures which are not really understanding what the imperatives are, you need to try to figure out how to communicate, and that was not something that was really considered, and it might even have been seen as being weak and not taking responsibility for just doing what was right. Like, people didn't seem to have very much of an awareness of that behavior, even if it was well intentioned, could have quite detrimental consequences. So I think that is a huge issue, which I think is not emphasized enough in the discussions about the residential schools.
Yes, and we've been talking about the negatives of the residential schools, and there definitely were negatives, but that should be balanced. How many people with other things? How many people know, for example, that in the 1920s and 30s, the Anglican Church Synod for Canada spent over half of its national budget on residential schools?
Yes.
They were definitely trying to fill the gaps there, and they were running special appeals for donations so that these residential schools would be equipped and well staffed and well fed, for that matter. We have to, you, in your article on grave error, you talk about a CBC program, documentary in 1962, I believe, called Eyes of the Children. And as I recall, that documentary was specifically about the Kamloops Indian Residential School.
It was.
And it showed happy children in 1962, and children at Christmas time crowding around the priest, and some nun teaching dancing, and it featured three Aboriginal teachers who were working with the children. This is a side of the Indian residential schools that we also need to recognize, I think.
It would help to have a more realistic assessment, and to have less of a just a complete blanket dismissal of everything that was done as well. I think the major problem is the opposition to education generally that now exists because of the kind of rhetoric that is going on. And I think that, historically, trying to understand what happened historically, we need to try to understand what the conditions were at the time. And if we can't do that, then we just get into sort of a moralistic types of arguments, which don't really do anything to help us to improve things, because what they do is they just paint people who are involved as having some evil character. I often find that the discussions are quite racist, in the sense of from the Indigenous leadership's kind of view that there was this kind of intentional attempt to just exterminate, or to, and there was definitely, as I said, insensitivity, when you hear things like getting rid of the Indian problem and these sorts of that, like, it shouldn't be seen like we're just eradicating various cultural features. It's like all cultures, regardless of what culture it is, has elements which are probably not conducive to thriving. And we shouldn't be sort of be seeing it as this is something that's close to me, and therefore I'm not going to critically evaluate this situation. But that goes for all cultures. It's not just, but it always gets played out as this, the terrible, quote unquote, white people and the virtuous indigenous population. And that's kind of the situation. Like that seems to be how it's often framed. Maybe I'm being overly simplistic, but and with all the clampdowns now on rational discussion, everyone is just kind of hanging their heads and going, like, hit me again. And maybe if I just take more hits, people will stop castigating me, but it just makes it worse. It doesn't, because it's not honest. And I really do, I do sense that there's becoming anger at the obvious lack of sincerity that is going on in the discussion and the opportunistic elements that are becoming involved.
You're pointing in what you're saying. What I'm getting out of it right now is that you're mentioning elements of religion, but it's not a Christian religion. It's a different religion. What I'm picturing here from your words, Francis, is that there are people who believe in a good and evil dualism on this issue. And that the whites were evil, and therefore white people need to self-flagellate and continually self-flagellate because they remain white. What's your take on that? Am I right? Are there white people who are busy self-flagellating?
Yeah, I'm not sure. And there's a number of different personalities that are involved in this whole kind of thing. There is that the personality type that sees it this way. There are others that are using it for their own gain. So they don't really believe it themselves, but they're taking advantage of that compassion. So this is what we're seeing a lot now. And this is really what I want to call out, is people who use compassion to impose their authoritarianism on society. And this can be either non-Indigenous people who are Machiavellian and are involved in this, or Indigenous people who are, and this is a term that I think is very, very appropriate, cry bullies. These unbelievable cry bullies who use their Indigenous identity to have these, advocate for these authoritarian types of punishments of people who are honestly disagreeing with them. So, people who are arguing for punishments because they disagree with someone who, and they could be wrong. Like, this is what, everyone who's putting forth an argument, they could be wrong. Like, they're not necessarily right, but if they're doing it in good faith and they think this is the case, even if it has a slightly bigoted kind of thing, what we need to do here is argue with people about this and say, no, I don't think that's correct, and that is misinterpreting. Not, okay, that's illegal, you're in jail. And we're almost there. We haven't quite got to this point yet, but we are soon going to be here, where if you say something which is considered to be, beyond the pale, it's going to be some kind of illegal thing, and you're going to, first of all, be subject to some kind of fining process. That's almost that we're on top of this right now. But then, of course, you have the whole residential school denialism kind of stuff, where that's going to be, well, they're trying to make this illegal now, which I'm just absolutely gobsmacked that someone's even entertaining this. But this is actually quite a significant argument that's being made. So I think we have a lot of different elements that are operating here. Some of them have this, I don't know if religious is the right word, but certainly cult-like kind of character, where they, to be belonging and to feel that they are going to be accepted in society, they think the way to do this is to be contrite and to show remorse and so on. Somewhat of a Christian, I guess it's kind of got a slight Christian kind of thing, as you should be humble and you should forgive, and like you should suffering is good and all these that's one element. But then I think there's a lot of more sort of darker types of personalities that are at work in what we're seeing as well. Anyway, in terms of, because I had some questions for you as well. This is great because I think we're having a bit of a natural flow here in terms of having a balanced conversation. The other thing that struck me when I was reading your work on the residential schools is something that I heard a number of years ago by I think he's a psychiatrist, Indigenous psychiatrist. I believe his name is Claire Brandt, and he wrote a piece which I thought was very interesting about what he called the ethic of non-interference, that he claims is something that exists within a number of Indigenous cultures. And this is historically many Indigenous cultures, and maybe all of them, I'm not sure if it's a generalization that can be made, there is it was not part of the culture for people to tell other people what to do. That was kind of seen almost as an arrogant thing to be doing. And then you see the residential schools where there would be this constant telling people what to do all the time. Do you think that does that play a role in any of the kind of dislocation and difficulties that have been experienced with respect to the residential schools?
Well, yeah, I've also read Dr. Brandt's work, and I've actually met with him years ago, and I understand the argument that there was a culture of non-interference. It's easy to, again, paint things with a broad brush and say this was the culture. I can think of examples where people were definitely punished for not doing the right thing, and one of the ways of punishing is excommunication, to use a Western European term. If you didn't cooperate, you'd be invited to leave the band, and you'd be on your own. That's a kind of punishment. I've also learned from elders when I was young that sometimes people were punished. For example, it happened, and this, I'm not saying this happened in all Aboriginal cultures, but it did happen in some, whereby if a woman was found to have cheated on her husband, it was okay to cut off the tip of her nose to remind her and show people that she was unfaithful. This is not exactly a culture of not so. Now definitely there was non-interference was a factor, but it was not absolute. For example, the Inuit, harsh climate. You would think that they would from to live in a harsh climate, they would have a set and enforce a set of rules. Well, the people I've talked with, and this has been affirmed by a marvelous doctoral dissertation back in where Inuit elders were interviewed, and their responses were compared to various schools of psychology, and found that the kind of self that is pictured was actually common to both, and that provided an insight for me into my book on the evolved self. there's a structure to the self that is cross-cultural. So the Inuit did have this culture of non-interference to a degree, to the point where the behavior of the person was going to affect the survival of the band or the community. Then those people were isolated and sometimes made to go off on their own, which of course in the winter could be a death sentence.
Yes. Yes.
So the culture of non-interference, yes, there's that element, but it was not absolute.
Mm.
And here's a problem I have with back when I was director of the Health and Social Development Commission for the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nation. This was in the 1980s. We used to joke about what we called professional Indians.
Mm.
What is a professional Indian? Well, it was someone who would hire themselves out, and they'd get dressed up for the part, and they would talk to mostly federal bureaucrats, do workshops, and they would do these flip chart comparisons, and the flip chart comparison always began with, well, European society is individualist, and Aboriginal societies were or are collectivist, and then it would take it from there. One was materialist, and you can guess which one, and one was spiritual, and so on, the whole darn list. And all of that, there's an element of truth to it, but again, it's not absolute.
Mm. It's a
All,
stereotype.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's a balance between these factors.
Yes. Actually, that's kind of funny because we have a friend whose name is Donnie Tababandon, who is an Ojibwe artist, a wonderful artist who did we have an abstract painting of his, which is really very, very striking. Anyway, he used to criticize some of his associates for being professional Indians. And I think that was someone who earns their living, the way he kind of saw it was someone who earns their living through living up to some kind of stereotypical indigenous, the stereotypical indigenous expectation. So if you're an artist, and I've seen this happen with respect to indigenous artists, is that if you do a painting which has a Inuit person standing over a seal hole with a spear, then that's something that the art galleries want because that's, part of the indigenous art kind of thing. Whereas if you do an app and that's why Donnie was so annoyed by it, is because he would do abstraction, and that was his artistic expression, and he would be told that his art wasn't indigenous enough, and like if he could just do some things with the spear over the the seal hole, the breathing hole, then that would sell. But all this kind of abstract stuff, that's not going to sell, that kind of thing. So he had a very critical view, because you can see how that would be very limiting to people, to have that expectation constantly being imposed upon you. And that happened all over the place in the North, where you'd have an indigenous artist who would be criticized because they weren't using the right stone to do their sculpture, or they didn't have the right style, this kind of, and it's like, well, you're an artist, so why should you conform to these, sort of very, very, stereotypical types of views about it? That's kind of an interesting observation that you were putting forward.
But of course, Francis, you're talking like an individualist. You believe that the individual should have a right to observe the landscape and use the resources and use the inspiration that and in fact a narrow interpretation of collectivism. What you describe in art that's been applied to life. It's now called Aboriginal spirituality. But I'm going to make a provision here, because we can talk about this, I think, in some length. But I think what's happening is that people of Aboriginal ancestry are being told how to be Aboriginal, and it's like a religion in some ways. In fact, Steven Pinker in 2003 did an article in which he said there's a new proto-religion developing that included 3 myths. The myth of the ghost in the machine, and from that myth of the ghost in the machine, you can get ideas like, even before one is born, but certainly when one is born, one could be a variety of genders, and sometimes doctors and parents make a mistake by observing a baby and say, "What a beautiful boy." Anyway, that's the ghost in the machine. Then there's the blank slate, and in some ways, the blank slate is the opposite of the ghost machine. It means that people can be shaped according to how the culture is presented. And if we can control language, we can control thought, and then we control the person, and we can have a utopian society, because now everything is controlled. And in what we think in terms of this pseudo-religious bend, a utopian society will result from all this. And then the third element is the noble savage. And that's what we really have been talking about so far in this conversation, I think, is the idea that and this breeds a sense of entitlement if it's taught and believed that we had a Garden of Eden here, a beautiful society where people were free to live as they would, and harvest from nature, and this was stolen. This was taken away, and there was a genocide, and therefore, as a descendant, I'm entitled to certain things because I was robbed of this. So that becomes part of, and in terms of the ghost in the machine part of this model, then who you are is, in a sense, predetermined by what race or gender you're born into. So so we have arguments now that if you are white, you're automatically part of the oppressive class. You're an oppressor. It doesn't matter what you've done or what your status is. And so that's something you can't do anything about. You're born with it. Okay, what we have here, and what I've been almost dancing around, is woke identitarianism. Why do I call it identitarianism? Because it's based on group identities. And intersectionality is simply a blend of different identities, but it's still taking the individualism away, like you were talking about the artist who has an individual viewpoint and is then restricted because of their ancestry as to how their art can be presented, and so you were recognizing the individual, but not the constraints. I can't see that collectivism, when it's enforced, is oppressive, in my opinion. However, you state, and part of this woke identitarianism is postmodernism, which was adopted as part it's postmodernism has been described as sort of a universal acid. I think it was Lindsay who used that. I could be mistaken.
Just repeat that again. Can you just repeat that?
That postmodernism is the universal acid. It will eat up and destroy anything.
Okay.
Okay, so but
Universal, what was the last? It's universal what?
acid.
Acid? Oh,
Yeah,
acid, as in like
yes.
corrosive, universal. It's weird. Postmodernism, and this is something that I've grappled with a lot in trying to figure out how its relationship to wokeism, which is wokeism is very totalitarian in terms of its character. So it's not just identity politics, it's the insistence that the identity politics must be accepted. But that seems to be contrary to postmodernism, which is got this subjective kind of character to it. So that was sort of the idea that we don't have an objective way of evaluating. We can't do that. It's all based upon our culture or whatever it is that is going to say, okay, well, I have my truth and you. That's the classic postmodernist kind of viewpoint, is that we each have our own truth. And so that kind of perspective. But wokeism doesn't, it has its own truth, which is that the identities that are the most oppressed have the most truth, and everyone else should, sort of defer to it. So that's kind of the interesting question, is how do we go from the sort of the prizing of subjectivity in postmodernism to the totalitarian insistence that something that an oppressed group, the most oppressed of the oppressed, is saying is the most, needs to be accepted the most. And I think it's because there's no objective evaluation mechanism to be able to constrain the claims of identity politics anymore. So that would be when you have I'll just use indigenous as the example here, but it could be trans or could be a black person. Like, it depends on, it's not exactly clear who is determined to be the most oppressed and all of these kinds of things. It's just that those who are the most oppressed must be believed, and or not, sorry, not must be believed. You must pretend to believe that what they're saying is true. But anyway, so that's kind of the dynamic that is going on with respect to wokeism, is the insistence of pretending to believe. And then the reason why you can't really fight back against those kinds of pressures is because the whole objectivity, like the idea that not that you're going to actually be able to be completely objective. No one ever said that, because we're human beings and we have our faults, and we have all these confirmation biases and all these kinds of things, but we're aspiring to do that. So we can at least look at other views and say, no, well, that doesn't seem to have evidence to support it. And that provides a check on what appears to be incredibly irrational things that are being argued, which cannot be contested, because wokeism is saying you must pretend to believe these incredibly irrational things that are being said, because they're being put forward by this person who has been determined to belong to this kind of intersectional accumulation of all these oppressed identities. So I think that's the connection between postmodernism, which is the subjective relativistic kind of thing that got inserted in the 60s, and this kind of totalitarian identitarianism, not just any identitarianism, the identities of the oppressed. So that's, or those who are perceived to be oppressed at this point in time. So
yeah, woke identitarianism has borrowed from many sources, and postmodernism is one. In terms of the noble savage myth, it has borrowed heavily from the New Age movement.
yes,
But it's also borrowed from Marxism. It's borrowed from Well, I was part, as a psychologist, I really believe this to be true. The self-esteem movement of the 1980s and 90s, but it didn't quite work out well. Uh, Wokeism has borrowed from that as well, but it's not true to any of it. And one of the things that I found fascinating, something you wrote, is that postmodernism gradually becomes reified. Now, that's, of course, as you just explained, a contradiction. You can't have it. So what? But then you went on to say that identities perceived to be oppressed must be made real. Now, can you explain that for me? Because I'm not sure I understand.
Yes.
How does one make real an identity?
Yes. So this is actually not my idea. It is James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose's idea in Cynical Theories. And that's
Okay.
what they say wokeism is. They say wokeism is reified postmodernism. And so what reification is and making real is the pretending to accept something as being true. So you're not actually making it real, except in the sense that by pretending that it is real, every other people might also think it's real, and it takes on a kind of a social uh like fabrication. So the best one is transactivism. I'll go after the transactivism file here, because transactivism for me is the wokest of all the woke kinds of arguments. So we have something called biological sex, which is an objective fact and not just some kind of social construct. So, and this has been made very, very clear now in my mind than it was historically, because I haven't really thought about it very much before a number of years ago. But biological sex is determined objectively by gametes, the kinds of gametes that exist. So it's not even chromosomes that it's determined by, which I thought initially it was, because chromosomes are quite a complicated business. Who would have thought? But there's all sorts of possibilities with respect to chromosomes, but still, they are divided generally into male and female circumstances, but they can be XXY and all this kind of stuff. But with the gametes, you have large immobile gametes, which are the egg, and you have small mobile gametes, which are sperm. And those, there is no in between on these. There's not like a half egg, half sperm thing. This is just not the case. So that's an objective fact. But what's happened with the reified postmodernism, if we're going to use that, or the reification process, is that the belief that there is this kind of spectrum and there is this kind of, halfway, must be accepted. So you must pretend to believe that. And that then creates a social kind of acceptance of that position. And you see this with, people who are sperm producers. Their whole thing is made up into production of sperm, and maybe they might be sterile. They might not be able to do it, but their apparatus is organized around the production of sperm. They claim that they are a woman, and they're not a woman. They can never be a woman, even if they have a body part chopped off and something, a hole made in their system or what. Like, that doesn't change anything. They are still male in terms of sex, but no one can say that. Everyone is prevented from saying that. And in fact, you possibly, maybe we have enough of a pushback now that this is not going to happen, but you have a possible situation where you could actually be before a human rights commission or something for denying the identity of an oppressed group and so on. And you have to call this person a he, because a she. You have to call this person a she because that is how they see themselves. So that's kind of the process of making it real, is the totalitarian imposition that everyone has got to pretend that this is the case, and by forcing everyone to pretend, it will become a general socially recognized reality. But it's not actually objective reality. It's just this kind of a social, a fabricated social agreement about something which is actually false. That's what we're seeing now in a whole bunch of different areas. And that's that's the most obvious kind of thing, where it's just so blatantly false, yet everyone is forced to do this and everyone is afraid to state what is actually going on with respect to this situation.
You've used the term pretend, and pretending you can get by with pretending for a while until somebody points out, hey, she's not sincere, she's pretending, and then you're in trouble. So
Yeah.
what you really need to do then is truly believe. No?
Well, this is why people are, I think, that why we have so much mental illness now, is that, everyone is in this, it's difficult to pretend, like to have a life of pretending. And you have two choices. You can either, if you're not going to pretend, one is just to fight against it and say, like Solzhenitsyn, I guess it was, who said, live but not by lies. Don't live by lies. So you say, that's it, I've had it, and I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to say what I think is true, even if you're going to, fire me from my job or fine me or put me in jail, or worst case scenario, execute someone like that. That's when you really are going to have trouble. And then you have the other possibility, is which you just convince yourself that this is true, that this highly improbable thing is true, and you really just don't think about it, and you just go along with it. So you kind of change your actual way you think about it to correspond with what is being demanded from you socially. So these
Well,
are kind of
that is certainly the woke position, that truth and knowledge is socially constructed, and therefore ideas like objectivity and scientific process are passe. They're in fact instruments of oppression. You have to believe the dogma, because that's where truth lies.
yes.
Yeah.
I think
Um,
that's what postmodern. That's why postmodernism is necessary, right? Because when you're faced with something that seems to be very improbable, then you can just say, well, there's really no such thing as improbable or probable, because it all depends on one's cultural context and so on. So if there is no probable or improbable kinds of claims, why fight against this position that is being put forward by a person who claims that if everyone just accepted this, then their oppression, they would be able to overcome their oppression and live their life as a thriving human being. Like that's kind of where compassion is being used to manipulate people, is that we're being told that by pretending to believe things which we don't think are true, this will, well, there is no such thing as truth anyway. It's not phrased that way because they've already knocked out the idea of truth. So by actually saying that we believe things that are being espoused as being true by groups that maintain they're oppressed, then we are helping them. That's a helping thing. And since there's no truth anyway, why would you be against helping someone when they're claiming this and this is very important to them, and you're just being a mean person with all your kind of colonialist kind of no, that's not, don't, this is nonsense and I don't accept that, and like those kinds of things are seen. To say to someone who is claiming to be oppressed, this is nonsense what you're putting forward, that is a terrible, mean, lacking in compassion. This is the kind of woke thing that is going on, and it's just like, no. And I'm becoming more and more resistant to this kind of thing, because I don't buy into this anymore. I don't think pretending to believe things that we think are untrue, I don't think this is helping anyone. And we can sort of see this with the social dynamics that are now going on with the transactivism, where we now have hundreds, if not thousands, of mutilated people who are now going to be much more likely to kill themselves, because not only are they mentally ill, they're mentally ill with body parts and hormones that are not appropriate, and so on. So that's in the end, it's going to be a complete disaster. And that was all created by this cry bullying that's constantly going on and manipulated by these narcissists and like psychopaths, like serious psychopathic personalities. And we have a lot of these, these situations that are going on.
Well, let's get back to that then.
Yes, let's get back to that.
Yeah, I found when I read Grave Error, I didn't find it controversial. What it's asking for, what it's stating, is that if there's a crime, the police should investigate it. I don't find that particularly controversial. I don't find it controversial, as we began our discussion, that, hey, there were some positives about residential schools, as well as the negatives. I don't find that controversial either. I don't understand what I do find interesting is the reaction that the book has gotten. We have a mayor in Quesnel, BC, whom I believe you have met and talked with, and I want to ask you a question about that. We have a mayor who there were calls for his resignation because his wife distributed, I guess, 10 copies of the book. Now, we have the Union of British Columbia Indians also calling for his resignation because they call him a residential school denialist. And when they, I think somebody likely realized that hanging a guy, a mayor in this case, because of something his wife done, that's somewhat sexist, I found interesting that somebody who was responding for the BC Union of Indian Chiefs said, well, the mayor himself had a copy of the book and showed it to somebody. Oh, but that has even more implications for humanism, doesn't it? Okay. What's your take on this? Why it seemed from afar, and you were right there, it sounds vicious.
Yes, it was, and it still is vicious. And I'm currently on a Facebook group. It's called Quesnel Talks, and there's a lot of angry people who are angry about what's happened to the mayor who are on this group. So there's a split in the community and in the city council. So that's what's going on behind the scenes, is that the existing mayor beat out the previous mayor, whose name is Bob Simpson. And there's a faction that's aligned with the old mayor, and they are mainly Lorianne Rudenberg and Scott Elliott. Those are the two snakes in the whole thing. And then, of course, the previous mayor. And then you've got the other councillors who are deer in the headlights, don't know how to deal with this. And the mayor himself, who, he got into this, like he's been persecuted, but he made mistakes by not just saying right off the bat, look, what my wife does is her own business. This has nothing to do with the city council business. So if he'd just done that, then he wouldn't be in the current situation that he's in. But not only did he do that, he said that he didn't agree with what his wife had done. And then he voted, as well as the other councillors, to denounce the book Grave Error. So all these people denounced the book that they had not read. It just boggles the mind, but it's all about being a virtuous person, being seen to be a virtuous person. And that's what they're doing. And the indigenous groups have a lot of power in many of these areas. And we're seeing this now in Lethbridge too. So there's a lot of businesses that do have business with Indigenous groups. The Indigenous groups want all these people and businesses to pretend to agree with what these Indigenous groups are arguing. And if they don't pretend to agree, the Indigenous groups will, retaliate against them. So this is, and this, the other interesting figure in this is this guy's name is Tony Goulet, who, although he was the one who sort of started it all, he's being used. So he's a pawn in a chess game that he doesn't understand. And so he's a naive person, and so he's become enmeshed in this by claiming that, well, his mother, see, that what happened was that the mayor's wife, Pat Morton, knew his mother, Connie, who was just sitting there in the tax business. So Pat Morton works for his son's tax business, and Connie Goulet is there. And Pat shares this book with Connie just to asking her opinion about what she thinks about it, because I guess they'd probably talked about Indigenous issues historically. She's known Connie for 30 years. And then sitting next to Connie is her husband, Lawrence, I believe his name is. And he is Tony's father and Métis, and Tony is Métis. And it's claimed that Lawrence is a residential school survivor. And this was very insensitive for Pat Morton to share this book with Connie, with Lawrence sitting next to her, because Lawrence, by seeing this happen, was very traumatized and all sorts of horrible things came up. But it has not even been established yet that Lawrence attended a residential school. So we've been asking Tony Goulet, Nina Green has been anyway, for months, to please specify what residential school his father went to, because this hasn't been established, and we need to establish all the facts about this situation. And there's a lot of, this is all again cry bully kind of behavior that, since, this person is an oppressed person, they can go now and do all sorts of horrible things to another person. And then when they're told, hey, you're doing a horrible thing, they go, hey, I'm an oppressed person. So it's like, no, you have to take responsibility for your actions. Anyway, so this is all going on at Quesnel. And then because of everything that was unfolding due to this crisis, Pat Morton was sort of saying to Tom Flanagan, look, is it possible that someone from the book can go and ask questions of these counselors who had just denounced the book in their previous meeting, so that we could, sort of get the ship, right the ship. And so then, because Tom's wife is ill and he's not able to travel, and it's quite a long distance, and but I thought, hey, I can. So I rented a car, went out there. And I'm used to doing this. I faced down 700 people at the University of Lethbridge, so I'm not going to be intimidated by any of this, and I'm just going to go and do whatever I have to do. And I just went up there, and we were told initially that we would be likely. It was possible we were going to be able to give a statement, a 3-minute statement, and I thought it was likely we wouldn't be able to do that. So I had prepared a question, the most important question that I could do based on the rules of the gallery, which is you must ask a question about something that's on the agenda. You can't just ask any question. And the most important question was the misinformation, which was being perpetuated by the British Columbia Indian Federation of Indian Chiefs, which was saying that there's evidence of unmarked graves in Kamloops, and that is not true. There is no evidence of unmarked graves in the Kamloops case. All we have is GPR, which is probably septic tiles that were laid or other excavations, because we have 15 of the 215 quote unquote remains that were being claimed to exist had to be downgraded to 200 because 15 of those anomalies turned out to be the dig that the Simon Fraser Archaeology Department did. They did excavations in this area. So that raises the question, if there were those 15 that were digging that the archaeology department did, maybe the other 200 are also digging that was been done in all sorts of other contexts. And since we don't have one parent who is saying that their child never came home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School, you know, who would those remains be? Like, this is not very probable that this is the case. So anyway, my question was directly on that. And these snakes, Rudenberg and Elliot, when I tried to ask this question, told me about that I was this discredited person, and that they didn't want to hear what I had to say, and that what was it, that I didn't belong there, that I should just go away. It's like, well, you guys 2 weeks ago were denouncing this book that I have contributed to, and a book that I think, although, I can, there's probably some, things that I would take issue with and maybe need to be corrected. I generally think most of the things that are written in there are, are at least worth an argument about them. And especially the stuff on the Kamloops case is really, highly credible, and based upon the research, at least my work anyway, is based upon the research of the fantastic researcher Nina Green, who is an amazing researcher, who has kept everyone, all our group, we have a few hotheads. She just says, we have to have the facts. We are always constantly establishing the facts, and we move forward from the facts. We don't extend beyond things, and we might make a few hypothetical kind of remarks, but they're going to be all factually grounded. So that was the Quesnel situation, which is still unfolding as we speak, because Pat Morton has gotten a lawyer, and she's suing the counselors for defamation. So, which, they are just beyond the pale what they've done. They should just resign, those people, because they are so incompetent and malevolent that they really should not be in a position of political power. They really have lost all credibility. And it was a good situation, because with the universities, everyone is saying, "Oh, who cares about them? They're lost." But with local democracy, this is still, people care about their city councils, and that's their representatives. And to have this kind of complete unbelievable situation unfold, is good to have some eyes on it.
Well, it's an interesting, very interesting conflict, isn't it? Because what you're describing is a narrative that has not yet and may never have an objective basis. And the narrative has to do with mass graves, and if not mass graves, many unmarked graves, with the implication that they're unmarked for a nefarious reason. They weren't just graves that were there and were forgotten and not taken care of, as was the situation in Cowessess, clearly. I was interested in the interview that, what is his name? Michael Moses? Is that his name?
Yes.
Yes, Michael Moses.
I don't know. I hope I'm not. Yeah, but there was with Pete, I think his last name. So there's a Métis lawyer, and yes, and yeah, Moses is his last name, and he's from Williams Lake, I believe, or he's a counselor at Williams Lake. Yes.
Yeah, I might not have remembered his first name correctly, but anyway, one of the things I took from the interview was that he's been influenced by Wokese. He says terminology will be created when it's needed. Well, that's wokeism. When we need it, we will create the words or change the meaning of words so that it fits our narrative. Yeah. That's my translation of what he said. Another thing he said is that the investigation, he didn't understand what the controversy was. The investigation is ongoing. on the schedule of First Nations people, not on the schedule of people who demand evidence.
Mm.
So, okay, so he's making a distinction here. He's saying First Nations people need to investigate this, and it won't necessarily be evidence-based.
Yes.
If it's not evidence-based, what will it be based on? Well, I leave that question hanging, or maybe you have an answer for it.
What the most oppressed believe. So this was interesting, came out of the TRC, and I believe it was Nietzsche, Ronald Nietzsche, whose book from it's called Truth and Indignation. It's one of the best books written on the TRC. Anyway, he was saying, and this is something I took up in my article, Relative Truths and Rent Seeking, but second, like, follow up to the Billy Remembers piece. Anyway, it was truth does not mean truth. Like in the way that we think truth means. Truth means what an oppressed person believes to be true. So this is now a problem, because that means we cannot have we cannot be trying to reach a common understanding of things. So that's postmodernism, this relative truth thing. And so this is really what is creating all the problems, is because postmodernism has knocked out this idea of searching for a universal truth. Not that we're ever going to find it, because we don't know. It's possible that there are clandestine, and that's the issue, clandestine burials in Kamloops. It's possible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. And until we excavate, we're not going to know whether there are any clandestine burials or not, right? Kamloops is the most interesting case of all of them, because it's not a cemetery. All these other places are cemeteries. So where's it, Blue Quills? For some bizarre reason, there's a guy in an excavator who's digging beside the cemetery, and he digs up some skeletons. But those skeletons were in the cemetery. So it's like, well, why have you got an excavator that you're using beside this cemetery? But everyone is kind of saying, oh, he found some skeletons. And it's like, well, don't be surprised if you find skeletons in a cemetery. They're going to be remains there. So these two issues of what were once marked graves but are now unmarked because the crosses and so on have deteriorated, and then the clandestine burials, those are two separate issues. Things have become a bit confused because of the quote unquote, the words quote unquote mass grave. So that term is sometimes used by indigenous neo-tribal elites. So for example, Roseanne Casimir of the Kamloops Band, the original press release was the remains of 215 children have been found. So she didn't use the word mass grave in that press release. She did use the words mass grave in a motion that she made to the Assembly of First Nations. So she has used the words mass graves before. But this uber clown, someone I call an uber clown, Sean Carlton, who is an academic at the University of Manitoba, he has kind of exploited this reference to mass graves to say, oh, these people are saying that mass graves are used all the time, the words, when they aren't. They're only used a small number of times. But that's not the issue. Mass grave, unmarked graves, it's clandestine burials. That's the issue, is how many clandestine burials are we dealing with here? And so far, zero clandestine burials. There might be, pardon me?
Very true. I follow your argument, although of course mass grave is more emotive. It's something that we think of when we think of the Holocaust. Whereas clandestine burials, well, that is at a different level. It could be that you had a murder and a clandestine burial, but that's not the same thing as a genocidal act of killing hundreds of people and putting them in a mass grave. That is different. Now,
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your take on Chief Casimir's position, because I'm confused by it, quite frankly. Initially, she said, as I recall, she said that the ground penetrating radar does not necessarily indicate a mass grave. And then she said, but the elders have told stories of children as young as 3 being murdered and buried in this apple orchard. And then several months later, like I believe it was the fall of 2021, that she then moved that motion that you alluded to, calling on the Assembly of First Nations to intervene on the question of mass graves. Where is she? Where is she at on this issue?
Yes, and this is, we're all just trying to unpack all that timeline, and that would be and maybe I'll do that, like specify her words, what they have been over time. But May 27th, which is coming up, which is looming, the 3-year anniversary, that was when the press release was put out saying the remains of 215 children have been found. So that was, and I don't remember when the 3-year-old, some as young as 3, kind of the wording was, but so that was May 27th. I'm not sure when, and Sarah Bollier, who's the GPR expert, big problem is that report that Sarah Bollier developed, which she gave a presentation on, I believe it was July 15th. So we had the May 27th announcement, and then July 15th was when we had Sarah Bollier give her presentation. That report was never released to the public. So we're still demanding that. That was paid for by the Canadian Heritage federal government. So it's public funds that were used to do that ground penetrating radar. At that presentation, Sarah Bollier said that it was 200 targets of interest. So that's because of the 15. She was told, probably by the archaeology department at SFU, raised the, hey, Sarah, have you kind of taken into account that the archaeology department did an excavation in that area where you're referring to these 15 anomalies? But then there were some other like press releases and presentations that were done in between that time. And I don't know what Casimir's kind of statements were, but the motion that she made at the AFN was either in June or July. So that was made about the mass grave. So the words mass grave were used by Casimir in her motion to the Assembly of First Nations. I believe it was in, I don't know the date now, but because it's confusing, because it makes it seem like it was September because of the dates on something, but it was actually either June or July, either early June or July 2021. So, but she's been exploiting it. I used to kind of want to cut her some slack, because I thought, well, when it was first heard about the ground penetrating radar, people misunderstood and thought that was actually remains. But then when Sarah Bollier did her presentation, we knew that it was just targets of interest. But Casimir is not a good actor. She's a bad actor, and she has been making statements and referring to things continuously as remains and graves and crime scene and all these kinds of words, when she knows darn well that, as Sarah Bollier states, just because you have anomalies found on the GPR, that's not evidence of remains. And then in 2022, a year later, Dre Humphrey, who's the Rebel News reporter, and her colleague did a documentary on this matter a year later, and they phoned up the Heritage museum, which is on the Kamloops site. And the person who was talking to them said that remains, there was evidence of remains. GPR had found remains, so there was remains on this site. So they're continuing to distribute misinformation, and it appears to be disinformation now. So misinformation is when you naively say something that is not correct information. Disinformation is when you're doing it deliberately. And the Kamloops band, they need to be called out. They are doing this deliberately to extract funds from the government because they've had many, many, many opportunities to correct the record as to what they've done, and they won't do it because, you know, there's money to be made from these false claims, and they're continuing to do that. So, you know, there's actual movement now in Quebec. So Quebec is the one province in Canada that is less woke than English Canada. And you have some actual journalists there who are doing work, and they started writing about it. So, you know, hopefully we're going to see movement now on the anniversary on May 27th. So Casimir is bad actor. And then their lawyer, Don Worm, he has been all sorts of machinations. Murray Sinclair, another bad actor. You know, like all these people, they just are not, because journalists don't ask them these questions. And I know they're doing it because they think, again, this is wokeism, which is, you know, pretend to believe things, and this will somehow, you know, allow people who are oppressed, who are perceived to be oppressed, to overcome their oppression. It just makes things worse because Indigenous people, I do believe, and I think I've sort of seen this with my interactions, even with people who detest me. I can tell they detest me. They actually want honesty. They do. They don't want to be lied to. They don't want to be condescended to and patted on the head and have people pretend to agree with them. They want to be treated with respect, which is, although you might not like what I have to say, just believe that I respect you enough to tell you what I think is true and not to kind of lie to you because I'm trying to manipulate you in some way, you know, like that. And I think eventually, hopefully, that's my hope anyway, that these people who detest me because they hate what I'm saying will eventually say, okay, that's what was going on there, is that, you know, although Frances might have not been the most, you know, said it in the nicest way or so on, she was at least trying to be honest with me. And I, you know, I found this very difficult and misinterpreted it and so on. So that's kind of where we're at. But Lloyd, for me to ask you a question, what is there things that you disagree with? You've said that you didn't find it controversial, and there's things that you agree with. What things do you disagree with that you saw in the book?
In grave error?
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to think on that. I think on the whole, I agree with the general thrust there. I didn't, as I said, I didn't find it very controversial.
Mm.
Um,
What about the
I
cultural
think,
genocide? Like this. So that's one of the Kamloops thing and everything. The clandestine burials, that was one controversial area. The other very controversial area is the disputing of genocide, the idea of genocide, or the TRC's kind of phrasing of cultural genocide. Do you agree?
I think the word genocide is overused, and it's another one of those words that there's a kind of a meaning creep here. That quite frankly, it's a way some people have of appropriating, I would say misappropriating the Holocaust that happened to Jewish people. Okay, that was a horrendous thing. And we say never again. Now, people who want to claim victim status want to claim some kind of relationship. Well, what happened to us is just as bad as what happened to the Jews. I find that, quite frankly, racist. That view. I don't know that I didn't pick up on grave error responding to that particular issue.
Yeah, Yeah, I don't, I
What
know
are the,
Jaime Rubinstein. So Jaime Rubinstein is one of the contributors,
uh-huh,
and Jaime Rubinstein has made many arguments in other articles. I'm not sure if it's directly in this one, his contribution here, but he's a Jewish person. Jewish, identifies as Jewish. Anyway, he gets very upset about the equivalence, I guess that is what he would call the false equivalence of the residential schools and the Holocaust. And of
yeah,
course, that's what got me into trouble in my own is that I thought it was an absurd comparison that was deserving of satirical treatment, was my approach, because I really do not think that Auschwitz and like and I, as far as I don't study the Holocaust, so I don't know, but I don't think it's a controversial claim to say that there were mass graves with respect to the Holocaust. I believe we have Babi Yar, where there was thousands of people shot and thrown into a ravine. We have other instances where you see pictures of, you know, bodies in large pits, and like, this is really genocide. This is, and Rwanda, like, if we're going to use a the non-Holocaust example, you have 800,000 people who are killed and like with machetes and also. So you're going to have, I don't know exactly what the burial situation was like in the Rwandan case. Things were pretty out in the open, like often mass graves too. I guess the Nazis weren't trying to hide what they were doing, but when you're killing 800,000 people, you don't have time to dig, or you wouldn't want to, like, the people in charge are not all that interested in giving proper burials to people anyway. So this is really not anyway. Jaime Rubinstein is one of the people who has written on this, and Barbara Kay also has stated this is really offensive. But I one of my colleagues at Mount Royal said on Twitter, and it's in Billy Remembers, Milena Razankowska, denying that the residential schools were genocidal is the same thing as denying the Holocaust.
well, it clearly isn't. We can disagree with that. If there was one thing in the book that I took exception to, and I think it might have been in the article by James Pugh, it was equating wokeism with progressivism and leftism, and I do take exception to
Yes.
that particular. I think wokeism, woke identitarianism. It's been said that the political spectrum is like a horseshoe. Well, yes, if you create an X and a Y axis, but when it comes to identitarianism, that is trending towards the right. So that horseshoe is taking a dip there. Uh, I I don't know that woke identitarianism actually fits neatly on the political spectrum.
Well, I think I'm not sure if you've heard of this thing called the political compass, which has
Yes,
got a,
I've
yeah.
read that.
So what you have, um, what's typically seen as left-right politics, which is um, economic. So do you think that resources should be distributed equally so that people can access what they need, like a needs-based thing? Or do you think that the capitalist system of, if you have the money to pay for something, that's a valid, like you agree with that? So that's the left-right political spectrum, economics. Then you have the authoritarian liberal kind of axis, which is, do you think that there should be free speech? Like, how wide do you think that free speech should be in a society? And the most liberal position is, sort of the John Stuart Mill kind of position, which is that unless you are inciting violence against people, you should be able to say the most horrible things that you want, like that you shouldn't be, it shouldn't be criminalized. There should be no criminal penalties. So if you have that kind of idea, then you have the left-wing liberals myself, I'm a left-wing liberal, so I'm socialistic. George Orwell would be the best example of this. So George Orwell was a socialist economically, saw all these terrible problems with capitalism, fought in the Spanish Civil War against the fascists. His left-wing credentials are not in dispute, but he was very, very concerned about the authoritarian character of many of his political fellow travelers, and was sort of pointing out, hey, don't, like, you really are trying to shut down people who have these right-wing ideas, and they shouldn't be shut down. They should be allowed to put forward their views, and they should be contested. And it's really only in the very extreme kinds of instances that you would want to have any kind of control over what it is that people say. So that he was a good example of a left-wing liberal, but you can have left-wing authoritarians, Stalin being a good example, Pol Pot being even a worse example, Mao, all these are all left-wing authoritarians, because economically they were like wanting equal distribution. And then you have your right-wing liberals, I guess, maybe Jordan Peterson would be an example of a right-wing liberal. There's probably a better example than that. And then you have the right-wing authoritarians, Hitler, of course, being the best example of. So that's kind of, and unfortunately, people haven't really seen it in terms of that quadrant kind of model, which I think is very, very important, because what we're trying to do now, at least in my view, is find all the liberals. So, like, liberal in terms of the speech question. So conservatives who have liberal views on speech, bring them together with the socialists, and let's have discussions now, as opposed to the authoritarians who are all trying to clamp down on speech for various reasons and so on. So I think that's kind of the dynamics that are going on with respect to that kind of angle. One thing I thought that you might disagree with in Grave Error in some of the pieces is the sometimes the kind of dismissal, what I think is probably a dismissal of, sort of the trauma, the intergenerational trauma kind of idea. So that's kind of the position, which, I'm not sure, my view, I'm still thinking through this idea, is to what extent are the residential schools responsible for the dysfunction that we see in many Indigenous people? Like, not all and so on, like, but you've got people in remote communities that there's been a history of alcoholism and all the fetal alcohol syndrome problems, and then you've got the sexual abuse problems and the violence and the economic hopelessness. And then it becomes easy, perhaps, to see that as due to being the residential schools, like to be able to pin that on the residential schools, instead of saying, no, the residential schools really are not a major factor in that dysfunction. I think that might be a position that comes out sometimes in those articles. Would you disagree with that position?
I think I might surprise you, but I have problems with the whole concept of intergenerational trauma.
Mm.
It might be just a fancy word for the effects of colonization, perhaps. But the problem I have with the concept of intergenerational trauma is it is taken to apply to Aboriginal people wherever they're from, regardless of the relationship between themselves and the colonizers. The relationship of the Dene to the Hudson Bay Company was quite a bit different than the relationship of the Cree to the Hudson Bay Company.
Yeah.
And the Cree, frankly, established an empire. They expanded westward and southward, and it was conquest, and they had Hudson Bay rifles to do it with. Okay, to say that you've got intergenerational trauma and it affects all people, that's not looking at the specifics of the history and the different relationship different peoples had with the colonizers, and it doesn't take into account the different colonizers either. For example, the British North America, as I'm sure you know, had issued the Royal Proclamation of, what was it, 1763, and that recognized an Aboriginal interest in the land that had to be negotiated, which is why we in Canada got treaties, except in British Columbia, and that is a different relationship than the relationship of the people Aboriginal to the United States, which and so we often got people from the United States, that is Aboriginal people, escaping across the medicine line where they'd be relatively safe. This kind of thing is not recognized. These differences are not recognized in the whole concept of intergenerational trauma. Now, could the residential schools have contributed to intergenerational trauma? Well, the way the story goes then, the way the narrative goes to support that is that okay, we went to residential schools and we lost connection with our culture and our families, and we lost parenting skills. So of course, and I think I talked about this in my article to some extent. So of course, we ended up with dysfunctional families, but it's not our fault. It's not our parents' fault. It's the fault of the colonizer, and we'll call that intergenerational trauma. Yes, it's possible in some cases where I did a workshop on residential school syndrome in the territories. I actually did several, but in one at Fort Simpson, one of the participants was a woman who went to a residential school in the territories, and she told her own story about how she was told that her parents were dead, and so she didn't see them. She happened to, after she graduated from residential school, she was walking in the town of Yellowknife, and to her surprise, she met her mother. But she couldn't communicate with her mother anymore because she'd lost her Aboriginal language. That kind of thing happened, but I'm not sure how common it was. What's happened is that extreme cases are reported, and then in the narrative they're made the norm. And the norm was that in all cases, well, no, in most cases, there continued to be contact between students at residential schools and their families. They went home for Christmas and for the summer holidays, and so on. So the idea that was intergenerational trauma. What's possible in some cases, as I suggested earlier, that we had something I call Indian residential school syndrome. That is possible, but it's a reach. It's an overgeneralization to say, okay, this is intergenerational trauma.
As well, and this is something that I've had arguments with on my research group with other people, and I'm still trying to think through this problem, which you kind of alluded to a little bit with the example of the woman in Yellowknife, is the kind of gap that was created between the people who the children who went to the residential schools and the parents and the rest of the community who didn't, and the inability to really connect anymore. possibly, like, I don't know if this was a widespread problem, but I can see that as contributing to social dislocation and breakdown when you have children who and there's this sort of idea of, you know, children being ripped away from the arms of their mother and sort of thing, which I think is probably a very highly exaggerated. It might have happened, like, certainly children were apprehended from families that were breaking down, like, but I don't think you would have a completely functional family and then, you know, ripping the like the Leonard Monkman the famous painting that everyone has is like all the RCMP and the nuns, and they're all ripping the, you know, this chaotic scene of children all being ripped away from wailing parents and stuff like that. But that's kind of might be a metaphor for the children going away for long periods of time, learning new ways of living, new values, new languages, and so on, then coming back to the community and not really connecting very much with the people who were still within the traditions and so on, and maybe not wanting to do those traditions anymore because they've now been kind of changed. Do you see that as having any like sort of the breaking down of the community through that kind of process?
Yes. The short answer is yes. However, the communities were the stress of change was already there. The communities were already breaking down in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
I have examples of people who went to residential schools who went back to communities and became chiefs and counselors.
Mm.
Uh, uh, were the old ways lost? Perhaps.
Mm.
Well, actually, yes, definitely in some ways. And were they lost with the we forget that back in the 1880s, 1890s, chiefs and counselors were, for the most part, not completely, there were exceptions, but for the most part, they were asking the federal government for schools, residential schools. They wanted, they recognized that the old ways were not working, were not going to work anymore. And, and the collapse of the Buffalo finish it off. But it was, but then there was land north, like northern Saskatchewan, which was dependent on the fur trade, and the fur trade was collapsing as well. So the old ways were going to have to weren't going to work. And in fact, if you look at it, the fur trade was an invention of Europeans too. But was a different relationship than. So the chiefs and counselors wanted the children to go to school to learn the new ways. They wanted to learn English, well, mostly English, and there was one residential school in northern Saskatchewan that the instruction was in French. But there was, I think, a recognition. Here's an example of it, and it reference a misquote of John A. Macdonald. Actually, it was one of his ministers who said that they wanted to kill the Indian in the child. What did that mean? Well, the definition of Indian was not a racial definition back in the 1880s. It was a cultural definition. So that is why in the Indian Act, as it originally was proclaimed, if you became a university grad or a priest or a minister, you ceased to be Indian. If you were a white woman and you married somebody who had Indian status, you automatically became an Indian. You were given a treaty number. Why? Because it was assumed that you had decided to adopt an Indian way of life. what was that way of life? It was living off the land and hunting and trapping and
Yes.
traditional ways, which were it was assumed that as people on reserve uh, became educated and learned new ways of doing things, they would cease to be Indian.
Yes. And
It
that
was a
was,
different definition.
yes.
And we don't, and we forget that that definitions have changed over time, and
Yes.
and the
And as well, like that's why I really dislike, and I will not accept it, these words cultural genocide, because it's confusing two concepts, which of course is the wokest. That's their bread and butter. And of course, this was I think it was a stealthful maneuver to get the word genocide implanted. And I was talking to Terry Glavin about this, and he didn't accept my view, but I was saying we could use the words culture side. Like culture side, I can say okay, because there was quite a draconian view about indigenous culture or indigenous cultures by the European colonizers. They thought this would be a good thing if we could just get rid of all that indigenous culture. This is heathenism. This is, savagery. This is that. And like, it's better, it's godless. It's just good to get rid of that. That's culture side when you think like that, instead of saying, look, people in their attempts to find meaning and live in the world often need cultural characteristics that are part of their heritage, and that helps them fit into society. Now, it might obstruct their ability to fit, but it could be benign or might even be helpful. And that's the way we should see it, as opposed to stamping out, this godlessness. And that's kind of the religious kind of, like, when you start thinking that way, it's like, out, damn spot, get, like, get rid of the evil, like, like, instead of, culture is learned behavior, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. It changes according to circumstances, this sort of thing. So I think let's get rid of the words cultural genocide. Let's talk about culture side, and then we would have a bit better understanding. But what happened with cultural genocide, the words cultural genocide, is they got cultural genocide into the discourse, and then they just removed the word cultural. So now we're stuck with genocide, which is a completely different meaning, which means the intentional extermination of a group of people, of an ethnicity, basically. And that, I don't think that there's evidence for that in the case of the Canadian context. It was mistaken policies.
why not simply call it assimilation?
Yeah. Well, because yeah, I think so. But assimilation is, I guess, I'm not sure if there's degrees of harshness with respect to assimilation. So there could be hard assimilation or soft assimilation. So hard assimilation,
You're saying there could be forced assimilation or voluntary assimilation.
yeah, or not. Yeah. So I guess that's a better way of putting it. The thing though is that with the whole culture side, like some of the language that was used in terms of this very, very, harsh way of dealing with people who were struggling to find their feet, in very difficult circumstances, and a certain amount of empathy and trying to help work things out, might have stopped some of the worst kinds of traumatic types of responses, like that's kind of, so I think that culture side might be a good rhetorical device to kind of draw attention to the harshness and the ripping away all these kinds of things, whereas, assimilation I think it's in the US context, they say the melting pot, right? Like those are the worst. That's kind of more soft assimilation. Is that you just melt in, it's all just kind of, like all the blurring and everything, not rip, like make people do this. And if they don't do this, well, they're going to die. So, and they're going to die out because they just can't adapt. And like, that was sort of the harshness of the whole thing. And a lot of the language, and I'm reading the historical documents, I find very jarring and not, this sort of this insensitivity, which I think the idea of culture side, does, draw attention to. But again, it's somewhat misleading because the history of humanity has been one of culture side. Like we really, we have the French, the French example is very good. You had all these dialects in France and kind of regional specificities. And when France began its nation building exercise, it was very harsh. It dealt very harshly with the local areas. And if people spoke their local dialect in the schools, they would have ridicule, various forms of ridicule that they would mete out against various students who are doing this. So, this nation building often has that characteristic, especially historically when, people were not very, they were not, they didn't have a lot of empathy about all the problems everyone was having and so on and so forth. But, yeah. Anyway, so, but I think there's different ways of phrasing things for various purposes, and culture side has an accuracy to it, although it is somewhat inflammatory, whereas cultural genocide seems to me to be a hopelessly confusing and, cross purposes, talking at cross purposes, which of course I think is the
Well,
intention.
a problem I have with the term cultural genocide is that it equates changing one's culture with physical death
Yeah,
and mass death at that. And
yeah,
I think that's very inflammatory.
yeah.
It creates division. It creates trauma where it does not necessarily have to be.
Yes,
A, a
I
problem,
think that's correct. So, I think
a problem
I would tend to agree.
yeah,
But,
I
I think
think
assimilation is the word that we're talking about. There's assimilation, which can be very harsh, be very not very sensitive, and assimilation, which is more voluntary, that sort of thing. But I think that's more when you're getting into integration. So, integration for me is the way we should really be approaching these things, is that, people, they can just continue to practice the things that they find gives themselves meaning, and it shouldn't be, stamped out, but if it's going to be counterproductive, we shouldn't feel uh, opposed to doing that. Like, for example, I find, because I'm a secularist, I find that the religious symbolism, headgear, whatever it may be, I agree with the Quebec approach to this, is that if you are in a position of authority, you are a teacher, you are a professor, you are a judge, you are a police officer, you should not, or a member of parliament, or what, like, you should not be having religious symbols that you are showing, because that is indicating your affiliation with, first of all, irrationality, but also a particular grouping. And it makes people who don't believe that feel that they're not, that now they have this distance that they're creating with you. So for me, that's a kind of a integration. Like, you get rid of those things in the public sphere. If people want to do things in their private lives and so on, that's up to them. But if you're a public servant, that's the public is what we all share. And since not all of us are religious or believe in a particular religion, you shouldn't be advertising your religion while you're taking up this public role, in my view. If you're just going to be a clerk that's not got any public facing kind of thing, that's another matter. But if you are involved in the provision of public services, I think that's just part of your job description. And many people who have religions don't feel the need to display them constantly and advertise their religion. So it doesn't mean you can't still believe your religion anyway. So, but that's a very contentious idea, because in English Canada, we don't have the same view of secularism as Quebec does. But I appreciate Quebec's position on that, and I think that's a form of assimilation. Is that which I agree with. But that's another matter. But I think that there's degrees of assimilation, and also some forms of culture which should be, it's benign, or it doesn't matter, or you're doing it in your private life. Other forms of culture which, if you insist on retaining that in a developing context where we're all trying to decrease conflict and improve our cooperation with others, you're going to have those features conflicting with that kind of tendency. And we have to be somewhat, well, my view is, I could be wrong on this, but I think we have to be critical. We shouldn't be afraid to be critical of certain cultural features, because culture is changeable. And so if I'm holding on to various aspects of my culture that I think are not conducive to human thriving, I should say, okay, I got to rethink that. And I'm not going to do that anymore. Like I've had this constant battle with vegetarianism. Like I ideally would like to be, because I think it's horrible what was happening to all the animals. But because of my culture and the fact that I've grown up in a meat eating culture, and I don't have a lot of supports for my being a vegetarian, I just kind of constantly fall back into the meat eating situation. And I don't celebrate that and think, how dare anyone criticize my meat eating culture. And maybe I'm wrong in that. Maybe because George Orwell, of course, was notorious for he thought that vegetarianism was was some kind of mental illness, like, and some kind of bourgeois luxury beliefs that people are, so maybe that's part of it too. Who knows? Anyway, Lloyd, we're coming to the 2-hour mark, and I'm just wondering if you think there's anything that you think needs to be said that hasn't been said.
Okay, well, thank you for throwing that in my lap. I was just pondering on what you were saying about culture, and I think there's a reification of culture that, well, as we talked about, as you mentioned when you talked about the Aboriginal artist, that can be inhibiting and it's something that is part of woke identitarianism. One of the things that woke identitarianism has done, for example, has identified Islam as an oppressed religion. Only it's treated not as a religion that is changeable. It's treated as an ethnicity that's somehow inherent. It's part of the ghost in the machine that I talked about.
Mm.
And the result, of course, is that people from Islamic countries who have uh, changed, have decided they don't believe in Islam anymore. They're being castigated, denied speaking opportunities at universities, even because they're seen to be divisive. And this is part of what we're talking about. Is identitarianism puts people into boxes. And so with respect to the the Aboriginal file in wokeism. Okay, there's a way of conducting yourself that will is appropriate if you're Aboriginal. And an example of that, I used to be director of life skills for the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College before it became First Nations University.
Mm.
And I would have students coming to me and telling me that they're really glad for their university experience because they're learning how about their culture in ways that it was that in their view it was lost at home. They weren't getting it in their home communities, and now at the university, well, what they were getting. I'm going to close with this thought. We've talked about the medicine wheel before.
Yes.
And you've talked about the medicine wheel in one of your articles, and you've said that that the medicine wheel gives the illusion of being a kind of a scientific process, but it's not, because it's fixed into 4 quadrants there. And I don't know if I've talked about this with you before, but it's like the 4 parts of this particular medicine wheel, and as you know, I've written on the medicine wheel concept. The 4 parts are what? Physical, spiritual, mental, and emotional, and I immediately had a problem with that back in my days with the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, because the term mental doesn't appear in any Algonquian language
Mm.
in Canada. It's just not there.
Mm.
And so where did that term come from?
Mm.
And the term spiritual is interpreted in frankly, a theistic way.
Mm.
Where did this medicine wheel come from? Well, I'll tell you where it came from. It was a New Ager in the 1950s who created it. And now the people at the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College were taking that as being Aboriginal culture. And this is a teaching that I had. Doctoral theses have been awarded on using that particular medicine wheel in analyzing various an application that was taught at that time too was the 4 races, red and yellow, black and white. Well, I'll tell you, that comes from a Christian children's song.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, it couldn't not have been traditional, because where would the pre-contact Indigenous people in Canada have come? Where would they come across the races red and yellow, black and white?
Mm.
So it, it turns out that the concept of holism is worth using, and if you can create a quadrant, as I did in talking about a counseling medicine wheel, then it has some basis in objective analysis.
Mm.
But the particular teachings that have been brought forward and as part of woke native spirituality, it's divorced from that kind. I think Indigenous ancestry traditionally was very pragmatic. And I've got examples, if we had more time, that I could go into on that. And by being pragmatic, it took into account, it was not religiously held views. I'll give you, if we got a brief amount of time, I'll give you an example of that.
Yep.
The Cree. The history books, we say the Cree entered the plains. Actually, they didn't just enter the plains. They were allied with the Assiniboines, and they defeated the Dakota and Lakota Sioux. And it was warfare. And The Métis as well went to war against the Sioux. But that was later. The Cree, when they entered the plains, they didn't keep their they didn't keep their beliefs that they had as a woodland culture. They adopted, quite frankly, the Siouan practices, like the powwows. That's a Siouan tradition that was adopted by the Cree who entered the plains, and various dances, various ceremonies were adopted. Why? Because the context had changed. And they looked at what was successful on the Plains culture and the Buffalo culture, and they said, well, we can adapt this, which means that they didn't take their previous beliefs as religiously held, that is appropriate for all time and all contexts. They were pragmatic.
Mm,
Now, what has happened with what I call the woke native spirituality is it becomes reified,
mm,
and so in L'Orange in the 1990s there was a political problem because the L'Orange Health Center adopted this form of native spirituality and threatened an elder support worker in Stanley Mission with disciplinary action because she obviously had not been able to effectively change the minds of the elders who still consider themselves to be Christian.
mm,
And the elders said, okay, we recognize that traditionally we haven't always been Christian. Stanley Mission became Christian, was established as a Christian community in 1853. We recognize that before that we weren't, our ancestors were not Christian, but we've been Christian for many generations now. And the native spirituality that is being introduced to us never was our culture. That's Plains culture. And they felt that the culture, the native spirituality that was being pushed upon them, they felt that as being oppressive. Now,
mm.
how's that for a role reversal? Now, here we've touched on a number of things that we've talked about in this particular session. We talked about cultural, you use the word cultural side. Well, the people who congregated and formed the community of Stanley Mission, that was voluntary.
Mhm,
The Anglican Church built a mission, and then across the river from the mission, the Hudson Bay Company built a post, a trading post. So it seemed like a natural place for these people to come together and form a community, and they did.
mm.
Yes, I would call that assimilation. I'm not sure I would go further than that. And it's on that thought that I'd like to just end this conversation because I know we've been over 2 hours now.
Yes, I think, and I could go on like another hour. I'd be happy to, but this people's attention spans these days are limited. But anyway, I just wanted to once again sort of say we've been discussing this book, Grave Error, and I'm hoping that after people view this conversation with Lloyd, who is a wise elder, that they will say, well, it's not, although I might disagree with some of the things in it, it's not got this horrible kind of, we've got to ban this, we've got to burn this, we can't discuss this is traumatizing, and so on. People should not feel afraid to try to engage with ideas which they might find some things that they agree with, they might find some things that they disagree with, and then they can just argue with me, and I would be happy to have any other Indigenous person on the program to be able to have the kind of conversation that Lloyd and I have just gone through, which I think has illuminated a number of different issues, which, although are not resolved, will still form the basis of further discussions and hopefully greater understanding. But on that note, Lloyd, I would like to thank you very much for appearing on the Rational Space Disputations.
Thank you very much, Francis. Take care.
Thank you.